both of them, of course, had their own agendas. Brezhnev, for the previous 3 years, was using every opportunity of exerting pressure on Yugoslavia, essentially trying to stop the Yugoslav leaders from complaining too much about the policy of stabilization, normalization in Eastern Europe that the Soviet Union was pursuing. For the Yugoslav side, it meant basically a reach for security, since these pressures were indeed quite serious. Then, in the summer of 1971, came the announcement of the new American policy towards China. I think that that changed the situation significantly. All of a sudden, the Soviets were on the defensive, and they needed friends. So this was the time to bury the hatchet, for the Soviet Union to essentially present itself in a more favorable light in the overall European, specifically East European context. There was an attempt to bring down tensions generally in Europe, as to prepare for what the Soviets expected to be new challenges in Asia. That was the Soviet part of the bargain. As for the Yugoslavs, it was terribly necessary to go back to the reaffirmation of the 1955 principles, the Belgrade Declaration, and so on, which the Soviets were really quite reluctant to yield on. They kept saying that there is no need to go back to something that was already stated. The Yugoslavs insisted, of course, that it should be restated again and again. And in a way, they got it. So everybody went away from this particular meeting, I think, rather satisfied, Tito especially, since now he could deal with domestic problems without any undue worry about what the Soviets' moves might be. The whole question of the Yugoslav model rests on the idea that there is a limit to systemic changes, and that limit is pluralism. One could not cross that line. So Tito, I think particularly in context of reform movements in Eastern Europe, and the high point of that was precisely what was happening in Czechoslovakia in 1968. In some ways, the Czech and Slovak leadership went beyond some of the things that were accomplished in Yugoslavia. Bearing in mind what happened in Czechoslovakia, bearing in mind the implications of such changes for Yugoslavia itself, I think that Tito developed a new bargain, which went like this. Instead of democratization, we shall go for the federalization of the system, under the assumption that the unity of the League of Communists will be inviolate. That is not to be touched. But within the republics, within the autonomous provinces, there would be considerable leeway for aspects of home rule, under the terms of overall ideological unity. So instead of democratization, federalization, and that, in a certain sense, prepared the ways for the very, very negative end of the whole Yugoslav story. I did not think that these events fundamentally changed the Yugoslav foreign policy, which was very adaptable, trying to find possibility of alliance wherever this was realistic. As far as Eastern Europe is concerned, I think that the stabilization of relations with the Soviet Union allowed Yugoslavia to pursue special relations with some countries. Romania would be a very good example. To a lesser extent, I think others, whereas some hostilities were exacerbated, with Bulgaria, for example. As far as Western Europe is concerned, I don't think that there were any significant changes. That, of course, was the weak part of the Yugoslav foreign policy, that the European arena was, in a certain sense, a sideshow in terms of the foreign policy orientation. Nor do I think there were any significant changes in the relations with the non-aligned. Here again, there were countries that at different points would be closer to Yugoslavia, in other points somewhat more distant. One of the things that Tito had to deal with in the non-aligned movement was the influx of countries that were effectively aligned. Cuba would be a good example. China's attitude, although China never formally joined this movement, that it belongs to the third world and so on. So there were people who were very much, there were countries that were very much ideologically aligned that were now participating within the non-aligned movement. And sometimes it involved some of the old members that were less non-aligned than they were perhaps in the 50s. This was a problem, and it meant that there were some special relationships. I was reminded, looking over these materials, as I was preparing this paper, Tito's own great hostility at the end of the 60s towards Muammar al-Gaddafi. He considered him a young man in the harem, simply somebody who was not sophisticated to play a significant role in the non-aligned movement, which to Tito's mind really did not belong to him. This is simply an insight into Tito's own reactions to different leaders that went beyond non-alignment, went beyond ideology. Frequently this was a personal thing. He, at that moment, I do not know how the story developed later on, detested Gaddafi. And there were some Western leaders that he did not like very much at all. A good example would be Pierre Trudeau, who was a little bit haughty to Tito, which of course was not the best way to Tito's heart. So there were personal elements in this as well.